right. Hi, everyone. This is Anthony Diaz with the Pop Health Show. And this show is for anyone that has a super strong passion between the intersection of emerging technologies, impact, and health. And sometimes we don't talk about all three of those topics, but it is a fascinating time in history where a lot of these topics are changing rapidly, and the confounding and collision of these topics is introducing some really great innovations. And I'm not going to steal her thunder, but to that point, Erin Murphy is here on the show today. I'm really enthused and excited to have Erin on the show. And Erin is the Chief Growth Officer at Topl. And I'm sure she's going to tell us what Topl's about. What's more important is about her origin story, where things are at. And she's got a really interesting background, and she's working on some fascinating things. Erin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for having me. Really appreciate it. Excited to kind of dig into stuff for your listeners.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, it's great to have you on. I really appreciate the time. Teleport us back. Take us back to where things started.
So yeah, my journey into Web3 started, hard to believe, but coming up on 3 years ago. But I guess I can go back a little bit before that. My background was primarily spent in the public sector before finding Web3. I, studied public health, actually, so that works out nicely here for your listeners. But I studied public health in undergrad and journalism. So like really not thinking that I would end up going into tech one day, which is the story actually of a lot of people in Web3, which I think is why I really love the industry so much. But after university, I actually did a Fulbright scholarship in Moldova, which is a small country in Eastern Europe. I had studied Russian in undergrad and wanted to kind of pursue my mastery of the language, and really was hoping for and working toward a career in international, sustainable development, economic development, and felt that Fulbright was a really good way to sort of kick that off, as it was. So I was in Moldova, and then after that went to Nepal. I worked mostly as an independent contractor there, primarily in microfinance initiatives or micro enterprise development initiatives. And but really a lot of my projects kind of ran the gamut from like peace building to STI prevention. It just kind of depended on the contract that I was working and the organization that I was working for. And those kind of ranged from different UN agencies to like really small NGOs, right? So it kind of ran the gamut there. Then I went back to Eastern Europe and was working in actually covering as a journalist, working for like a media development organization. We worked in all the former kind of Soviet space or Eastern Bloc space, covering what was essentially the transition still from communism to capitalism, or to free markets and the challenges that kind of came with that. And that was really interesting exposure to a different type of NGO work. And then eventually my career just kind of took me back to Asia, so I really kind of worked across a range of topics, primarily in the either in the humanitarian aid space or in the economic development space in Eastern Europe and in South Asia. And I would say that my kind of aha moment, so to speak, of when I realized that this NGO scene really wasn't the way to achieve change in the way that I think I felt passionate about, was, I'm not sure if you remember the earthquakes in 2015 in Nepal, but
Yes.
they were devastating series of 7.8, 7.9 scale earthquakes in a country with very little infrastructure. At the time, I was working for an Indian NGO running their Nepal operations, and I just really felt like it brought out the worst, unfortunately, in the humanitarian aid sector, and really started to see just, billions of dollars were pouring into Nepal. And I was just kind of wondering, like, where's all this money going, and how is it being accounted for? I felt like, we weren't moving fast enough, that we weren't reaching enough people. It wasn't being distributed equitably. And so I kind of became interested in starting my own initiative, that even though I knew it would be small, I could, I wanted to sort of see the impact that I could have. So I started a fair trade fashion company, actually. So I was manufacturing primarily in Nepal, a bit in India, and then retailing in the US. But because I had spent, pretty much my whole career in nonprofits, I felt, I didn't really know how to scale a business. I wanted to not be a hobbyist. I wanted to kind of take it to the next level. So that's when I applied to business school. So I
Mhm.
went to I went to do my MBA, and as Murphy's Law would have it, my MBA, the second year was spent primarily all during COVID, which turns
Mhm.
out had sort of paralyzing implications for my supply chain. I had inventory just kind of sitting on runways in South Asia where there, were really long lockdowns. But I didn't want to stop working on my startup. I was, in this atmosphere where I could be meeting with investors, or I could be meeting with, even my fellow classmates who maybe had started businesses or were interested in impact or sustainability. So I didn't want to just kind of abandon it. And one of the things that I decided to focus on was, is there sort of a unique tech angle that I can work into my brand?
Mhm.
Um, and I was kind of considering two, I guess, emerging technologies and this was about I guess, 3 years ago. One of which was um, augmented reality. So could I provide this experience for my customers where they could kind of transport themselves to the places in Nepal and India where my products were being made, where they could, you know, see and sort of interact with the women who were working in the co-ops that I was working with, and sort of like better understand the ethos of the brand. And the other was blockchain. I was really interested in blockchain kind of from a couple years before that. And I wouldn't say as much in cryptocurrency, but in the sort of potential that blockchain as a technology offered kind of
Mhm.
as the real world economy. And so I kind of started digging into, blockchain and traceability. And, it definitely is a really strong use case. You see examples from, IBM or Walmart or sort of other like enterprise level implementations. And I literally Googled like ESG or sustainability blockchain, something like that, and Topl came up.
Mhm.
And I had a pitch competition coming up, and I emailed them and I was like, hey guys, like I think what you're doing is amazing. I really need you to teach me how to talk about blockchain with investors. And they jumped on like a 2 hour call, and I just really sort of fell in love with the mission and the people. And, I sort of told myself that if the timing wasn't right with my startup, this would be a really awesome second option. Like, do I join this team? And I decided to do a fellowship with them in my final semester, and I just, continued to kind of fall in love with the mission, and I felt like the timing was sort of impeccable. So I joined the team full time in 2021 in the spring. And since then, I've worked in kind of two capacities. When I first joined the team, I was a product manager and worked mostly on sort of product growth, and that was for our traceability product. And then about a year and a half ago, I moved on to the executive team, heading up our growth team. So I work primarily now with growing the developer ecosystem, growing relationships with partners, business development, basically anything that grows the company. I'm working on it.
Mhm. I love it. I love it. Well, Erin, I heard a lot of different things, but the common thread there is there's tremendous opportunity that you've always seen for humanitarian efforts, for doing greater good, for doing things outside of ourselves. It seems like you've always identified significant levels of probably abundance, but yet you have these also these areas of like suffering, tremendous opportunity. It led you into your own entrepreneurial efforts, and then you decided to kind of parlay that into Topl. And so, yeah, it is a pretty fascinating time, right? These notions of currency are changing. There's opportunities to unlock value. You have humanitarian efforts that can now, there's this element of sort of tokenizing and assetizing that's happening. Blockchains can unlock that value. But yeah, this is really exciting. Tell me a little bit about, what you're passionate about now, what you're working on, maybe, how that parlays into what Topl's doing, if you'd like to speak about that. But yeah, just love to hear more about the present and how your previous passions are converging into what you're focused on now.
Yeah, I think there's sort of two major themes that I am working toward sort of every day, both in like my own kind of interests and things that I kind of do on the side to help other projects, and then obviously what I'm doing at Topl, and they're all sort of related. The first is this idea of financial inclusion, and I think this idea gets talked about a lot, especially in by fintech and crypto companies. And I want to just sort of call out and acknowledge that we have a very, very long way to go on financial inclusion, right? And just I'm sure some of your listeners are aware, but the definition that I sort of use for that is really what is the access to capital or to financial services that people in a given market have. And I think it's really especially important to look at how that breaks down, because sometimes we look at numbers of crypto adoption and it's really promising. We see countries like Nigeria or Vietnam or Turkey, right, where the numbers are seemingly really high. But I would really caution us and advocate that we interrogate those numbers, because just like any form of wealth, we want to know how that's distributed, right? Who is it that owns all this crypto in these markets? And is it a way of holding value? Is it actually being used for currency purposes or for payments? So I think there's a lot of work we as an industry kind of need to do to better understand that. But in general, I think that financial inclusion is something I'm really passionate about, because for a lot of my career I worked on, I guess, the sort of byproducts of a lack of financial inclusion, which can be anything from anything that we can think of that kind of can spring from poverty, be that conflict or resource conflict, or other sort of social injustices that we see, the marginalization of minorities, or especially women's issues. In so many societies, even in our own, women don't have the same access to capital, right? So that's like a theme that I think is really important to me, and it's something that's really important to Topl. The second would be this idea that we need to put a number or a value on impact. And personally, I look at, and what I mean by that is what we need to sort of understand and capture the value of impact initiatives, because right now I would argue that we're not really doing that. I think we have some use cases or examples. If you think about companies like Patagonia, right, where they have this incredible brand equity because they do right by their suppliers, because they have this mission, because they give so much back. But a lot of these we could argue are sort of like one-offs, and we want to see, what I would like to see is across industries an effort to measure their impact beyond, and also just beyond carbon. So personally, right, I look at carbon markets and I get really excited, because ultimately, what we could argue the Kyoto Protocol did was, it assembled people who, global decision makers, who ultimately came to the decision that there is a monetary value or a price that we have to put on this negative externality. But what, a lot of the founders of Topl believed, what I believe, and I think what a lot of the sort of, if you want to say, the regenerative finance space believes, is that there are other types of impact, other types of externalities that are not valued yet with a monetary value. So, what if my company employs 40% women? Can that be turned into an impact asset that's tradable? Can generate, revenue, an ancillary revenue stream for my organization? Or even if we think beyond just sort of social impact that could be rewarded, be that, scholarship programs or, employment numbers, fair wage practices, things like that. I think there's other environmental benefits that are not necessarily tradable right now. So for example, I work, with an organization that's tokenizing the biomass restoration. They work primarily with the American or the Mesoamerican reef. So they're restoring this biomass to the reef. This is something that a lot of, for example, fisheries or cruise lines might want to buy those tokens, because it's sort of directly tied to their business externalities, right?
Right.
So I think creating a more robust market for these impact assets is kind of critical to giving businesses a way to actually give back or invest. In my case, I would say I believe that it's really an investment in things that are actually more pertinent to their business operations than maybe just taking, arguably the easier route of buying carbon credits.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting, Erin. Yeah, I had someone on the show last week that he was talking about there's almost like 100 something, credits in the space, in environmental, there's like plastic credits. I didn't even know there's that's pretty fascinating to hear. Yeah, for the company that's trying to improve their scores or impact, that's 2 in 1, easy to do, right? It's like they identify the opportunity, then they buy the tokens, and then it should register, right? That there's
Right.
Brings me to a question. We have these ESG scores, and obviously you and I know there's it's very political, right? Some are like, oh man, needs to change. Oh, it's perfect as is. But then sometimes you have these other companies that are out there and they're like ESG scores are high, or the opposite, they're very low, but they're making such a big impact. So how are the scores made? How are they influenced and things like that? I think we both could agree that the scores probably will always need to evolve and change. Are they evolving and changing for the better faster than what they need to go? Who makes these scores up? Things like that. But what's your take on some of these credits outside of carbon and climate credits and how that relates to ESG? Do you think that ESG is going to be that mechanism that holds it, or is there this other standard? And maybe you can tell us a little bit how Topl maybe plays a role in that movement, if anything.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think we have a somewhat controversial take on ESG, which is that, in a lot of ways, I sort of wonder, is ESG just like a reincarnation of CSR, or
Right.
we found a new acronym, we kind of gave it a new scaffolding, and
Has more economic pull.
at the end of the day, how are we actually evaluating it? So I think there's that piece. I think there's the other piece that kind of goes to what I was discussing earlier about value creation.
Yeah.
So right now, I think the problem with a lot of ESG efforts is that we see like one-off in basically they're not income generating, or they're not revenue generating, or they're not sort of financially or economically sustainable. So every time a company sort of wants to, participate in a new ESG effort, if that's, sequestering carbon in some hectares of the rainforest, or, sending girls to school, whatever that is, they have to sort of invest new capital. And so I think until, these efforts can become self-sustaining, we are really not getting to sort of the heart of the matter, which is going back to what I was saying earlier, this idea of positive sum economics, that people
Right.
who are investing in positive externalities should be financially rewarded for that.
Right.
But I do think this is where I'm sort of bullish on the use of blockchain, and I'm sure someone from AI or from another emerging tech would say the same thing about the role that their tech or their space can have in ESG reporting. But ultimately, I think we're not going to converge on a singular set of standards for ESG, right?
Right.
As long as we have a super robust market, essentially, I think it was like almost $1 trillion or something last year.
Yeah.
And that could be sort of convoluted with other sort of impact finance, so don't quote me on that, but it was some really exorbitant number that's spent on ESG efforts and reporting. And but 97% of ESG, or people who work in ESG, so think of like sustainability officers or impact officers, or people on those teams, data scientists, et cetera, complain or have this pain point of, that they feel like they can't really prove what they're doing. And
Right.
so I think that does present a really unique opportunity for blockchain. I think ultimately, if we're not going to converge on one set of global standards for, this is how we define the environmental, the social, and the governance aspects of ESG, then a really sort of great alternative is, okay, use whatever standard you want, but figure out a way to implement a technology that improves the confidence or trust in your data. right? So if you're
Right.
telling me that you've sequestered this much data, or you've bought these carbon credits, or sorry, you've sequestered this much carbon, or you've bought these carbon credits, or you've invested in, um, you know, regenerative agriculture, or,
Right.
whatever that sort of impact or ESG initiative is, well, prove it to me as a stakeholder, be I a
Right.
shareholder or a board member or a
Right.
customer, right? And let me
Right.
decide if I believe
Right.
that that's value creating, right? And so if I can see that, okay, this company has decided to really clean up its act with its supply chain, and they're committing
Yeah.
to sort of public visibility of where things are sourced from. Or, this company has decided to invest in renewables, and they're,
Right.
putting all of this data on chain. And, I don't know how familiar your listeners are with blockchain, but I would say with this use case, there are two sort of really important fundamental characteristics of blockchain that matter. The first is that blockchain is essentially time stamped, right? So we know when an event happened. And the second is that data is immutable. So unlike the centralized databases that are often used to house this kind of data, which can be manipulated, blockchains cannot, right? That data is put on chain and it's there forever. It can be
Mm.
appended, but it can't be edited, right?
Right.
So I think those are really valuable sort of innate characteristics of the technology that render it important for ESG recording and tracking. But, I think there's a general kind of fear, one, because I think the technology is really difficult for some people to understand, which is totally fair. There's also a lot of kind of myths and misconceptions that need to be, myth busted, which, block everything. If I put it on chain, it's all public. That's not true. There are a lot of ways to encrypt data, to make proofs around the data, to only share with relevant parties, right? And I think
Mm.
the most important message that I always try to communicate to people who are interested in sort of taking this first step is that's the most important part, is just committing to some level of transparency.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be everything all at once, right? It's just a show of good faith. It's do it as a pilot, do it with only like a certain set of data until you're comfortable with it. But I think people underestimate the value that we'll have with stakeholders, right?
Right.
Taking that
Right.
first step. And, frankly, transparency is not a two-way street, right? We are going down this road toward people demanding more transparency. And I don't think in like 10 years or 5 years, someone's going to be like, you know what, let's be less transparent.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
happening. So just get out in front of it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. It's so much like a societal shift. And I like the way you put it. It's like you have these ESG scores and everything, but it's really the variables and putting truth around those variables and putting those out in the open, because at the end of the day, impacts, the numbers don't lie, but the algorithm could change the overall formula. We may be off in our calculations on how much impact we need to have reeds, plastics, and that's probably going to change. We're going to find out some new value. We dig into the Earth's crust and we find this immense amount of value, and then that probably might diminish the needs for other impact areas or something like that. So discovery. And so at least along the way, you have those trust factors, you have the ledger, and then you can kind of start to always do the math backwards, right? But if everything's just boiled into one score, it's almost like trying to like pick a team and do Moneyball on picking a team when all you have to go by is the scores from championship games from just like every other year, right? You can't really choose a team.
Yeah.
You need to know the player stats. You need to know the variables at a micro level to be able to build back up, right? So it's fascinating.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point that, your friend raised about all these sort of standards boards or accreditation organizations. I would actually argue that I think that's a good thing. I think the centralization of these models is problematic. I mean, we've seen that in carbon markets, in the past year, if anyone's familiar with that sort of Guardian expose, that this centralization of an authority to make credits is problematic. And so we work with some kind of smaller organizations who are really focused on, the way that one particular soil type or forest type can sequester carbon. And if I'm on sort of like an ESG team, I think I would really value that expertise over a sort of more generalized model that may or may not be as accurate, right? So I think the plurality is actually really important. It doesn't have to be a negative, but the way we can sort of bring uniformity is through the way that we present the data.
Yeah.
Collect the data.
Nice. No, I love the way you put it, Erin. This is This is super exciting. I know you touched a little bit too on kind of where we're going, and yeah, this whole concept of transparency. We're not going to, as a society, say, okay, let's go back a little bit to the dark ages, right? Things are moving pretty fast. But tell me a little bit about your. I guess one of our kind of my last questions I always like to do on these shows and these episodes is talk about the future. Tell me a little bit about where you see the future in this space going, how you like to play a role, like what's going to excite you, keep you engaged in this space. What would you like to see happen? I just love to understand your vision of the future.
Yeah, well, there's so much going on in this industry, and it moves so fast that I'm sure if you asked any other person in Web3, they would probably give you different answers. But I'll tell you the things that I'm really excited about. I think, firstly, I'm very excited about the sort of specific avenues that I see people working on when it comes to financial inclusion. So when I'm thinking about, there's a lot of dApps and projects working on this idea of an alternative credit score, which I think is an incredibly sort of utility-driven way to think about how cryptocurrency or how blockchain can actually make a difference. If we know that more than 1 billion people on this planet don't have access to banks, and then we also need to sort of layer in the complexity that a lot of people might have access, but they don't trust banks. That's just the reality in a lot of markets where you have high inflation or you have just a general lack of institutional trust. That having this sort of alternative scorecard, if you don't have a way to establish credit, but maybe you can attest to your skills that you have achieved, or to, if you're a farmer, I have produced every year for the last 6 years this amount of coffee, it's with this quality grade, that has earned me this much income, and that can act as sort of an alternative credit score. And I think we've sort of seen a couple projects working on this, and now we're really trying to test how do microfinance institutions or alternative finance institutions respond to this data. But I'm sort of really excited about is more, how do regular people respond to this data, right? So I've sort of always very pathologically optimistically believed that if people will buy like a random NFT, then would they not also buy an asset that they know, not only will impact another person directly, but that also can act as an investment for them.
Right.
I personally would love for my sort of future state to be just investing in, different regenerative farming organizations all around the world. And because you're removing the friction of access to capital or access to really, really expensive capital, which is the reality for most people on the planet, that they're looking at 50 to 100% interest rates. If you can remove those like incredible barriers, and really, we're not even talking about huge amounts of money. We're talking about $5,000 that can have a massive impact on a co-op with farmers, right?
Right.
So I think the next sort of stage that I'm really excited about is to see how do retail investors and kind of ordinary people, so to speak, respond to these opportunities to invest or to participate in these initiatives. And then I think the other piece is and what Topl's really focused on is also the tokenization of, real world assets. So we started in supply chains, we've done a bit in commodities, we want to do more in that space. But, since so many people on the planet their wealth or their sort of position is determined not by, dollars in the bank, but by other assets, cows, livestock, water access, plots of land given out through the family, whatever that may be.
Yeah, vehicles, warehouses, yeah.
Exactly. And I think those are that's how, if we can tokenize those, and those can be, used as collateral or used as something that brings utility to those people, then we're actually kind of coming out above rising above some of the barriers that we currently see to crypto adoption in some markets. So I think that's something that I think is also really exciting.
I love it. Erin, it's powerful work you're doing, and it's fascinating to hear and see your background and your passions for humanitarian efforts, right? That ethos, and seeing this vision of where currency was, where it's going, where assets are going. And it is an exciting time to be alive. It's fascinating. It seems like most amount of change in the concept of assets and the space is going to occur. It's happening now, right? But it's definitely like rapidly happening between now and 2030.
Absolutely.
And so, Erin, this was great. I know we went a little bit over our typical.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, this was great. Honestly, I'd love to have you back. I know Topl's evolving a little bit, and I just love to have you come back on the show and hear more, because it is an evolving space, and there's not as many people you would think in this space that's kind of playing this intersection of the enablement of this to occur. So it's fascinating to hear about your work. So I'd love to have you back on. My very last question for you would be, if our listeners want to get a hold of you, what would be a good way to do so?
Yeah, so I would say the best way, so if you want to learn more about Topl and what we're doing and how we think about things and interact with our core team, would be to jump in our Discord. You can also reach me there in Discord. If you're not comfortable with Discord, you can always reach out on LinkedIn or Twitter. So I can, give those links to you, Anthony, so that you can share those with listeners. But absolutely. And I would say that's a sort of general thing in the Web3 space, is that if there's a project that you like or a person that you find that you're interested in talking to, most of us are just really excited to jump on a call with someone. So don't be shy.
Absolutely. Well, Erin, thank you so much. This was great really exciting to hear about what you're working on and where you've been. And
thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And to our listeners out there, this is the Pop Health Show. This show's for anyone that has a super strong passion between the intersection of emerging technologies and impact. Thanks so much, Erin. This was great. Thank you so much.
For sure.
All right.